The crack of a Winchester rifle echoing through the unforgiving Chiricahua Mountains should have been a death sentence for the two young Apache girls cornered by ruthless scalp hunters. Instead, it was the salvation brought by a lone mountain man who had sworn off humanity entirely. He risked his life, shedding blood in the freezing mud to deliver them home safely. But it wasn't the brutal rescue that made history. It was what their mother did the very next morning that left an entire frontier town absolutely paralyzed with shock. Winter arrived early in the high country of the Arizona Territory, bringing with it a biting wind that sliced through the pines like a sharpened skinning knife. Arthur Callahan had spent the better part of a decade living in complete isolation among these towering peaks. A mountain man by trade and a hermit by necessity, Arthur had left the civilized world behind after the brutal realities of the Civil War had fractured his soul. He stood well over 6 feet tall, a mountain of a man wrapped in thick bearskin and worn leather, his face obscured by a thick, dark beard and a wide-brimmed hat that kept the falling snow from his piercing blue eyes. On this particular Tuesday afternoon in November of 1874, Arthur was tracking a wounded elk through the heavy snowdrifts. The woods were usually a sanctuary of silence, broken only by the wind or the call of a lone hawk. But today, a different sound shattered the peace. It was a high, terrified shriek, immediately followed by the cruel, booming laughter of hard men. Arthur froze. He tightened his leather-gloved grip on his Sharps rifle. It was not his business. The unspoken rule of the high country was to mind your own affairs, to keep your scalp attached to your head. Yet, a second scream, more desperate than the first, clawed at the remnants of his conscience. Moving with a silent, fluid grace that belied his massive frame, Arthur crept through the dense underbrush toward the ravine where the sound had originated. Peering over a snow-capped ridge, his eyes narrowed at the scene below. 3 men, heavily armed and smelling of stale whiskey even from 50 yards away, had trapped 2 young Apache girls against a sheer rock wall. The girls, no older than 10 and 12, were dressed in traditional Texan dresses, now soaked and muddy. They clutched each other, trembling violently, their dark eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Arthur recognized the leader of the men immediately. It was Amos Fowler, a notorious scalp hunter and outlaw who made a lucrative, blood-soaked living terrorizing the indigenous camps across the territory. With Amos were 2 of his regular enforcers, a brutish man named Levi and a wiry, nervous killer known only as Thomas. Amos was holding a thick coil of rope, grinning with a menacing, yellow-toothed smile as he stepped closer to the older girl. "Well now, boys," Amos chuckled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Looks like we stumbled onto a mighty fine payday. The commander down at the fort will pay a handsome bounty for these 2. Tie 'em up tight, Levi." Arthur felt a cold fury ignite in his chest, a righteous anger he hadn't felt in years. The girls were defenseless, separated from their tribe, and facing a fate worse than death at the hands of these savages. Arthur did not hesitate. He raised the heavy Sharps rifle to his shoulder, exhaled slowly, and pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the rifle echoed like a cannon blast through the ravine. The heavy lead slug struck Levi square in the chest just as he reached for the younger girl, throwing his massive body backward into the snow, lifeless before he even hit the ground. Chaos erupted instantly. Amos and Thomas scrambled for cover behind a cluster of boulders, drawing their 6-shooters and firing blindly up the ridge. Arthur didn't stay put. He dropped the single-shot rifle and drew the twin Colt revolvers holstered at his hips, sliding down the snowy embankment with calculated ferocity. He moved like a ghost through the falling snow. Thomas popped his head around a rock to aim, but Arthur was already there. 2 rapid shots from Arthur's right Colt caught Thomas in the shoulder and neck, dropping the wiry killer into the freezing mud with a gurgling cry. Now it was just Amos. The outlaw leader realized the tide had turned and panicked. He broke from cover, sprinting toward his horse, tethered a few yards away, firing wildly over his shoulder. One of the stray bullets grazed Arthur's thigh, tearing through leather and slicing the skin. Arthur ignored the burning sting. He took steady aim and fired. The bullet struck Amos in the back of the knee. The outlaw screamed, collapsing face first into a snowdrift. Arthur walked slowly toward the writhing man, his boots crunching heavily in the snow. Amos rolled over, clutching his shattered leg, his eyes wide with pain and sudden, dawning terror. Wait, Callahan! You don't want to do this! You're turning on your own kind for a couple of savages? You lost the right to call yourself mankind a long time ago, Amos, Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He aimed the Colt at the outlaw's chest. And I have no kind. Amos reached desperately for the gun he had dropped in the snow, but Arthur was faster. A single, final shot echoed through the canyon, and then the ravine fell deathly silent once more, save for the whistling wind. Arthur turned his attention to the two girls. They were huddled together against the rock wall, staring at the giant man covered in blood and gun smoke. Arthur slowly holstered his weapons and raised his hands, palms open, trying to look as non-threatening as a massive mountain man could. "It is over," Arthur said softly, unsure if they understood English. He pointed up the mountain toward where his cabin lay hidden. "Storm is coming. Big storm. You freeze here. Come with me. I keep you safe." The older girl stepped protectively in front of her sister. She looked at the bodies of the outlaws, then back at Arthur's solemn face. With a slow, hesitant nod, she took her sister's hand. Arthur led the traumatized girls away from the slaughter, up into the treacherous crags of the mountains, hoping he hadn't just ignited a war. The journey to Arthur's cabin was grueling. The sky above had bruised into a deep, violent purple, and the snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. The temperature plummeted rapidly, freezing the blood on Arthur's trousers. He noticed the younger girl's steps faltering, her small moccasins completely soaked through and freezing to her feet. Without a word, Arthur knelt, unbuttoned his heavy bearskin coat, and scooped the younger girl into his arms, wrapping the thick fur around her shivering frame. The older girl watched him closely, her dark, perceptive eyes studying his every move, searching for treachery. Finding none, she kept pace at his side. By the time they reached the hidden cabin, nestled tightly against the base of a towering granite cliff, darkness had fully consumed the mountain. Arthur kicked the heavy oak door open and hurried them inside. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished with a cot, a sturdy wooden table, and a large stone hearth. Arthur immediately went to work, striking a match to the kindling he had prepared that morning. Within minutes, a roaring fire cast a warm, flickering orange glow across the log walls. Arthur pulled a heavy woolen blanket from his cot and handed it to the older girl, motioning for her to sit near the hearth. He gently set the younger girl down beside her sister. Going to his modest larder, he produced a tin of dried venison, a loaf of hardened sourdough, and a small pot of water, which he hung over the flames to boil. For a long time, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackling of the fire and the howling of the blizzard battering the heavy wooden shutters. Arthur sat on a stool across from them, tending to his grazed thigh with a rag and a splash of strong whiskey. He winced silently, pouring the alcohol over the wound, binding it tightly. He looked up to find the older girl watching him, holding a piece of venison he had offered them, but not eating. "Eat," Arthur encouraged, his voice a soft, rumbling bass. "You need strength. Tomorrow, when the snow stops, I take you home." The older girl hesitated, then took a small bite. Seeing her sister eat, the younger one voraciously tore into the bread and meat. The older girl finally spoke, her voice surprisingly steady, heavily accented but understandable. "You killed the men who steal scalps." "Why?" Arthur paused, staring deeply into the fire. "Because they were evil men, and no child should suffer the evil of men." "They say the white men in the mountains are demons," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Chosovi. This is my sister, Magina. We went too far from the winter camp looking for late berries. The bad men found us." "I am Arthur," he replied simply, "and I am no demon, just a man who prefers the quiet." The night passed slowly. The girls eventually fell into an exhausted sleep on Arthur's cot, wrapped in every blanket he owned. Arthur spent the night sitting in a wooden rocking chair by the fire, his Winchester resting across his lap, keeping watch over the howling wilderness outside. He knew that Amos Fowler's men often ran in larger packs, and there was always the possibility that a search party, either outlaws or Apache warriors tracking the girls, might stumble upon the cabin. Dawn broke crisp, clear, and bitterly cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine, untouched world of blinding white. Arthur prepared a quick meal of oats and honey. He knew they had to move immediately. If Apache scouts found a white man with 2 of their children, they would not ask questions before putting an arrow through his chest. Arthur strapped on his snowshoes and fashioned makeshift snow wraps for the girls' boots using animal hides and twine. They set out across the mountain, Chosavy guiding the way based on the landmarks she recognized. They trekked for nearly 4 hours through the deep powder, the silence of the forest heavy and expectant. As they crested a large ridge overlooking a sweeping, snow-covered valley, Arthur suddenly stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. Rising from the snow-covered boulders and pine thickets, seemingly materializing out of thin air, were more than 20 Apache warriors. They were painted for war, their faces grim, bows drawn taut, and rifles leveled directly at Arthur's chest. They had him completely surrounded, cutting off any avenue of escape. Arthur slowly raised his hands, making no sudden movements toward his weapons. From the center of the warrior line, the ranks parted. A woman stepped forward. She was strikingly tall, dressed in beautifully beaded buckskin, her dark hair streaked with silver. Her face was etched with the fierce, hardened lines of a woman who had seen a lifetime of war and sorrow. She possessed a commanding presence that demanded absolute silence from the valley. Chosavy and Magina cried out, sprinting past Arthur and throwing themselves into the woman's arms. The woman dropped to her knees, burying her face in her daughter's hair, her stoic facade breaking for just a moment as a ragged sob escaped her lips. This was Nalin, the respected matriarch of the camp, and the mother who thought she had lost her children forever. Arthur stood perfectly still, fully prepared to die. He knew the history of blood between their peoples. He knew that his intentions didn't matter to a mother who saw a white man holding her daughters. Nalin stood up, her dark, piercing eyes locking onto Arthur. She spoke rapidly in Apache to Chosavy. The girl pointed back toward the mountain, gesturing frantically, explaining the terrifying ordeal, the outlaws, and the giant man who had rained down fire to protect them. The warriors did not lower their weapons. The tension in the icy air was thick enough to choke on. Nalin stepped away from her daughters and walked slowly toward Arthur, her expression completely unreadable. She stopped mere inches from him, staring up into his weathered face. Arthur held his breath, waiting for the signal that would send a dozen arrows into his body. Instead, what Nalin did next would defy every rule of the frontier, setting in motion a chain of events that the nearby town of Silver Creek would never, ever forget. The icy wind howled across the snow-swept ridge, but Arthur Callahan could not feel the cold. His entire focus was anchored on the bone-handled knife that Nalin, the fierce Apache matriarch, had smoothly drawn from the beaded sheath at her waist. Surrounding them, the painted warriors remained statues of lethal intent, their rifles leveled at Arthur's chest. For a man who had survived the blood-soaked battlefields of Antietam and Shiloh, Arthur knew the fragile line between life and death. He stood perfectly still, his massive frame relaxed, accepting whatever judgment this grieving mother deemed necessary. He had saved the girls, but in the brutal calculus of the frontier, a white man holding Apache children was often a tragedy waiting to happen. Nalin did not raise the blade toward Arthur's throat. Instead, she looked deeply into his piercing blue eyes, searching for the deceit that had so often poisoned the words of the men from the valleys. She found none. She saw only the heavy, quiet sorrow of a man who carried too many ghosts, and the undeniable truth corroborated by her daughter's frantic testimonies. With a swift, practiced motion, Nalin dragged the sharp edge of the blade across her own left palm. A line of bright crimson welled up instantly, stark against her weather-beaten skin. Arthur furrowed his brow, momentarily confused, until Nalin stepped forward and firmly grasped his right hand. She turned his palm upward and, without hesitation, pressed her bleeding hand tightly against his bare, calloused skin. The warmth of her blood spread across his lifeline. The men of the town speak with 2 tongues, and their promises are written in water, Nalin said, her voice carrying a resonant, unyielding power that cut through the whistling wind. Her English was heavily accented, but chosen with deliberate precision. You, mountain man, speak with your blood. You shed the blood of the coyotes who hunt our children. Now, my blood is yours. To the Chiricahua, you are no longer a stranger of the white faces. You are Inde. You are a brother to this valley and a son to these peaks. The words hung in the freezing air, carrying a weight that sent a profound shiver down Arthur's spine. He looked at the intertwined hands, the mingling of blood, and felt a sudden, violent crack in the icy fortress he had built around his heart for a decade. The isolation he had so desperately sought was shattered, not by violence, but by a grace he never believed he deserved. Nayland released his hand and stepped back. She gave a sharp, guttural command in her native tongue. Instantly, the rifles were lowered. The warriors unknocked their arrows. The immediate threat of death evaporated, replaced by a heavy, solemn respect. Nayland gestured toward the distant ravine where Arthur had left the bodies of Amos Fowler and his men. "My scouts will find the carrion you left in the snow," Nayland declared, her eyes narrowing with a dark, vengeful promise. "Return to your fire, Arthur Callahan. Tomorrow, the sickness that breeds in the valley will be excised. Tomorrow, the town will understand the debt they owe you." Without waiting for a reply, Nayland turned. Chosavy and Magina looked back at Arthur one last time, offering small, reverent bows before following their mother into the tree line. Within seconds, the entire war party vanished into the blinding white landscape, leaving Arthur standing completely alone, staring at the drying blood on his palm. Down in the booming, treacherous mining settlement of Silver Creek, miles below Arthur's mountain sanctuary, a different kind of storm was brewing. The town was a festering wound of greed and ambition, ruled from the shadows by Mayor Thaddeus Boone. Boone was a ruthless opportunist who presented himself as a civilized gentleman while quietly funding scalp hunters to clear the indigenous tribes off land rich with silver veins. That evening, inside the opulent, smoke-filled back room of the Silver Creek Saloon, Boone sat across from the town's highest lawman, Sheriff Tobias Flint. Boone swirled a glass of expensive Kentucky bourbon, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the rugged dirt of the frontier. "Amos is late," Boone noted, his voice smooth but laced with irritation. "He sent word 3 days ago that he had cornered a group of stragglers. The bounty the territorial governor is offering for Apache captives is too lucrative to mismanage, Tobias. If Amos has bungled this, I will hold you responsible for recommending him." Sheriff Flint shifted uncomfortably in his chair, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill in the room. "Amos knows the high country better than any man, Mayor. The blizzard likely slowed him down. He'll ride in by morning with the merchandise. He never fails." A few blocks away, inside a small, warmly lit apothecary and dress shop, a woman named Sarah Caldwell stood by the frosted window, looking up at the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains. Sarah was a fiercely intelligent woman who served as the town's unofficial physician. She despised Boone and the cruelty of the town, staying only to tend to the miners' families who had nowhere else to go. Her thoughts, however, were not on the town's corruption. They were anchored on the giant, silent mountain man who came down from the peaks once a season. Arthur Callahan had brought Chosavy and Magina to her mind? She knew the Apache occasionally traded medicinal herbs with her in secret. But Arthur was the one who haunted her quiet moments. She remembered the gentle way his massive hands had handled delicate glass vials the last time he traded furs for medicine. She had seen the profound sadness in his blue eyes, and she harbored a quiet, burning hope that one day he would stay in the valley just a little longer. As she watched the snow swirl around the peaks, she whispered a quiet prayer for his safety, entirely unaware that the mountain man had just altered the destiny of the entire territory. Morning broke over Silver Creek with a blinding, crystalline brilliance. The heavy blizzard had passed, leaving the muddy streets buried under 2 feet of pristine, glittering powder. The town was beginning to stir, with miners trudging toward the assay office and merchants shoveling the boardwalks. Inside the mayor's office, Thaddeus Boone was pacing anxiously, his pocket watch snapping open and closed in a rhythmic, agitated tempo. At precisely 9 o'clock, the frantic, terrified clanging of the town's warning bell shattered the crisp morning air. "Apaches! War party on the ridge! God almighty! They're riding into town!" The lookout in the church tower screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. Sheriff Tobias Flint burst out of the saloon, drawing his revolver, his face draining of all color. Doors slammed shut down the length of the main thoroughfare. Mothers dragged screaming children into alleyways and cellars. Men ran onto the wooden porches with shotguns and repeating rifles, cocking the hammers but freezing in their tracks as the procession came into full view. Riding straight down the center of Silver Creek were over 50 heavily armed Chiricahua warriors. They did not attack. They did not whoop or fire their weapons into the air. They rode in a terrifying, disciplined silence, the only sound the heavy crunch of hooves in the deep snow. At the head of the column rode Nayland, mounted on a magnificent, muscular white Appaloosa. She sat tall and regal in the saddle, draped in thick wolf furs, her expression forged of cold, unyielding iron. Sarah Caldwell stepped out of her apothecary, ignoring the pleas of the blacksmith next door to take cover. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her heart pounding against her ribs. She sensed instinctively that this was not a raid. This was a reckoning. Nayland brought the procession to a deliberate halt directly in front of the mayor's office. The tension in the air was so thick it threatened to suffocate the entire street. Thaddeus Boone, flanked by Sheriff Flint and a half-dozen trembling deputies, stepped out onto the raised boardwalk. He tried to project authority, but his hands were visibly shaking. "You have no business in Silver Creek, savage," Boone shouted, his voice echoing off the false front buildings. "Turn around and ride out, or my men will cut you down where you stand." Nayland did not flinch. She raised her right hand, signaling her warriors. 3 men rode forward, leading a string of riderless horses. Slung over the saddles were 3 frozen, blood-soaked bundles. With a swift kick, the warriors severed the ropes, sending the lifeless bodies of Amos, Fowler, Levi, and Thomas crashing onto the snowy street, rolling to a stop directly at the mayor's polished leather boots. The townspeople gasped collectively. A murmur of horror and shock rippled through the gathered crowd. "I bring you the trash you sent into my mountains," Nayland declared, her voice carrying absolute authority. She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a thick, leather-bound ledger, a book her scouts had pried from Amos Fowler's frozen coat. She tossed it effortlessly through the air. It landed with a heavy thud on the wooden boardwalk next to Boone. "Open it," Nayland commanded. Sheriff Flint hesitantly knelt and picked up the book. He opened the pages, and the blood drained further from his face. It was a meticulous record of bounties, payments, and scalp tallies, all bearing the signature and seal of Mayor Thaddeus Boone. "Read it to your people," Nayland challenged, sweeping her dark eyes across the terrified townspeople. "Read how your leader pays in gold for the blood of our children. Yesterday, these dogs trapped my daughters against the stone. They would have sold them for your mayor's silver." Boone swallowed hard, realizing the town was listening intently. The miners and merchants, many of whom had families, looked at the mayor with sudden, dawning disgust. "It's a forgery," Boone stammered desperately. "An absolute lie." Nayland ignored him. She looked past the mayor, her voice raising to address the entire settlement. "My daughters live because of one man, a man of your skin, but not of your poison. Arthur Callahan." At the mention of Arthur's name, Sarah Caldwell gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. Her heart swelled with an overwhelming mixture of pride and relief. He was alive, and he had saved them. Then came the moment that would leave Silver Creek paralyzed with disbelief. Nayland gestured again. 2 massive warriors rode forward, carrying 3 heavy, reinforced canvas sacks. They heaved the sacks over their horses' flanks, dropping them onto the street. The impact split the canvas open. A collective gasp echoed down the street that eclipsed the sight of the bodies. Spilling out onto the snow were hundreds of massive, unrefined silver chunks and gleaming gold nuggets. It was a king's ransom, a fortune pulled from the secret veins of the Chiricahua Mountains, worth more than the entire town's bank held in its vaults. "This is not a tribute," Nayland announced, her voice echoing like thunder. "This is a purchase. I am buying the high peaks. From the timberline to the clouds, the mountain now belongs to Arthur Callahan. He is Inde. He is our brother." Any man who crosses his property line, any man who hunts in his woods, any man who brings harm to his door will answer to the full wrath of the Apache nation." Nalin leaned forward in her saddle, locking eyes with the humiliated mayor. "You will draft the deed today. You will register his land. And if Arthur Callahan requires anything from this valley, you will provide it with respect, or I will return and burn Silver Creek to the ash it deserves to be." The town was absolutely stunned into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The matriarch had not just spared a white man, she had elevated him above the corrupt laws of the territory, effectively crowning him the undisputed sovereign of the high country. Sarah Caldwell stepped off the boardwalk, her boots crunching in the snow. She walked right past the trembling sheriff, right past the furious mayor, and stood near the piles of gold. She looked up at Nalin, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "I will see to it," Sarah said, her voice clear and resolute. "I will make sure the deed is drafted and the mountain is his." Nalin studied the courageous woman for a long moment, recognizing the fire in her eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of respect passed between them. The Apache matriarch turned her white horse, signaled her warriors, and rode out of Silver Creek as silently and powerfully as she had arrived, leaving behind a shattered, corrupt empire and a town that would forever whisper the legend of Arthur Callahan. The humiliation of Mayor Thaddeus Boone hung over Silver Creek like a foul, stagnant fog. The spectacular display of Apache power and the undeniable proof of Boone's bloody enterprises had fractured his iron grip on the settlement. Inside the heavily guarded walls of the assayer's office, the staggering pile of Apache gold and unrefined silver sat on the heavy oak tables, gleaming with a mocking brilliance. It was a fortune that could build a city, yet it was strictly designated to purchase a mountain for a hermit. Boone paced furiously across the floor of his office, the crystal decanter of bourbon clinking against his glass as his hands trembled with unadulterated rage. He glared out the frosted window at the townspeople, who were now whispering in huddled groups, casting suspicious glances toward his headquarters. Sheriff Tobias Flint stood by the roaring fireplace, looking thoroughly defeated, his badge catching the firelight. "We are ruined, Thaddeus," Flint muttered, wiping his brow. "The miners are talking about a strike. The merchants are demanding a tribunal. If word of that ledger reaches the territorial governor in Prescott, we'll both hang from the highest cottonwood in the valley." Boone slammed his glass onto the mahogany desk, the liquor splashing over the rim. "We are not ruined, Tobias. I built this town from the mud, and I will not surrender it to a painted savage and a deranged mountain man." Boone's eyes narrowed into dark, calculating slits. Nalin bought that land for Arthur Callahan. But the law of the territory is explicit. If a landowner dies without an heir or a drafted will, the property and all its mineral rights reverts to the township. "It reverts to me." Flint swallowed hard. "You cannot send men up that mountain. You heard the matriarch. The Apache will burn Silver Creek to the ground." "The Apache are honoring the blood pact they made with Callahan," Boone sneered, a wicked, desperate smile creeping across his face. "If Callahan dies in a tragic dispute, stripped of his scalp, who are the Apache to blame but rogue bounty hunters? They won't burn the town if the perpetrators are already gone." Boone pulled a heavy iron key from his vest pocket and unlocked his lower desk drawer. He withdrew a thick stack of greenbacks. "There is a man drinking at the far end of the saloon. He arrived on the morning stagecoach from Tucson. His name is Harlan Ford. He is a mercenary, a former border ruffian who cares absolutely nothing for Apache threats. Take this money. Tell Ford that if he brings me the head of Arthur Callahan and the deed to the mountain by tomorrow night, I will double this amount in raw gold." Across the street, inside the warm, lavender-scented air of the apothecary, Sarah Caldwell was standing firm before Judge Harrison Webb. The elderly judge, a man who possessed a shred of integrity that Boone had never managed to fully extinguish, adjusted his spectacles as he meticulously penned the legal boundaries of the high country. Sarah had refused to leave his side for 6 hours, ensuring every single word Nalin had commanded was enshrined in territorial law. "It is done, Miss Caldwell. Judge Webb sighed, pressing his heavy brass seal into the hot red wax at the bottom of the parchment. Arthur Callahan is now the sole proprietor of the Chiricahua High Peaks. May God have mercy on his soul, for he sits on a throne of unimaginable wealth, and men have killed for far less. Sarah carefully rolled the parchment, slipping it into a waterproof leather tube. Arthur did not ask for this wealth, Judge. He asked only to protect the innocent. I will ensure he receives this document. As Sarah left the courthouse and walked down the boardwalk, the freezing wind bit through her wool coat. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the snowy street. As she passed the narrow alleyway beside the saloon, she heard the low, gravelly voice of Sheriff Flint. Instinctively, she stepped into the shadows behind a stack of whiskey barrels, holding her breath. "Ford, you leave at first light," Flint was whispering urgently. "Callahan is holed up in a cabin near the western ridge. Take your 3 best shooters. The mayor wants it done quietly, but he wants it done permanently. Kill the mountain man, burn the cabin, and bring back the deed." A raspy, chilling chuckle echoed from the darkness. "For the gold Boone is offering, Sheriff, I'll bring you his head in a basket. Consider the mountain man a ghost." Sarah's blood ran cold. The town was not going to honor the matriarch's warning. Boone's greed had eclipsed his fear. Arthur had stood alone against heavily armed men to save Chosavy and Magina. He had risked everything for strangers. Now, the full, treacherous weight of Silver Creek was marching up the mountain to slaughter him in his sleep. She did not hesitate. Sarah sprinted back to her apothecary, her mind racing. She gathered her thickest riding skirts, a heavy, fur-lined coat, and a pair of sturdy leather boots. She packed her medical bag with bandages, morphine, and carbolic acid, knowing the violent nature of the men she was trying to outpace. Finally, she retrieved a small, double-barreled Derringer from her cash box, loading it with trembling hands. Moving swiftly to the town livery, she saddled her sturdy roan gelding in the dim light of a kerosene lantern. The stable boy was asleep, and the streets were practically deserted as the bitter cold forced everyone indoors. Sarah knew the trail up the mountain was treacherous in the daylight. At night, in the wake of a blizzard, it was practically a death sentence. But as she pulled herself into the saddle and dug her heels into the horse's flanks, Sarah felt an overwhelming surge of determination. She spurred the horse into a desperate gallop, disappearing into the dark, freezing timberline. She had to reach Arthur Callahan before Harlan Ford did. She had to save the man who had saved them all. The darkness of the high country was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of night broken only by the pale, ethereal glow of the moon reflecting off the endless expanse of freshly fallen snow. Outside the sturdy log cabin, the mountain wind howled with a ferocious intensity, battering the heavy wooden shutters like a wild animal demanding entry. Inside, however, the air was still and warm. Arthur Callahan sat in the center of the room at his hand-hewn wooden table. The yellow, flickering light of a single kerosene lamp cast deep, dancing shadows across his scarred and weathered face. He was methodically cleaning his twin Colt revolvers, a nightly ritual that grounded him. The familiar, sharp scents of gun oil, burnt black powder, and sweet wood smoke filled the confined space. He paused his meticulous work, setting the soiled rag down onto the polished wood, and slowly turned his right hand upward toward the lamplight. Stretched horizontally across his broad palm was a clean line of white linen, tightly binding the shallow cut where Nolan's bone-handled blade had met his skin earlier that day. The memory of the fierce Apache matriarch's piercing dark eyes and the searing, shocking warmth of her blood mingling with his own played repeatedly in his mind. Inde, brother to the valley, son of the peaks. The profound, impenetrable isolation he had fiercely cultivated and protected for a decade had shattered in a single afternoon. He was now bound to a people and irrevocably anchored to this perilous land. Yet this sudden, uninvited sense of belonging terrified him far more than any outlaw's bullet ever could. Suddenly, his sharp ears picked up a sound that did not belong. Beneath the roar of the wind, the sharp, unmistakable noise of a horse blowing hard, its breath whistling raggedly in the sub-zero air, echoed through the frozen pines outside. Arthur's survival instincts, forged in the bloodiest theaters of war, took over instantly. He snatched the heavy Sharps rifle from the table, extinguished the kerosene lamp with one fluid swipe of his hand, and pressed his back completely flat against the rough-hewn logs beside the heavy oak door. The cabin plunged into total, blinding darkness, illuminated only by the dying, blood-red pulse of embers glowing in the stone hearth. He listened with absolute concentration. The heavy crunch of hooves in the deep powder was erratic, stumbling, and desperately slow. This was not the calculated, stealthy approach of an Apache scout, nor the confident ride of a hardened bounty hunter. Moving with the silent grace of a mountain cat, Arthur cracked the heavy wooden door open a mere inch, peering intensely through the narrow sliver of moonlight. A lone roan gelding was staggering blindly into the snowy clearing, its broad chest heaving violently, its dark coat entirely encrusted in thick, white frost. Slumped sideways over the saddle, barely maintaining a grip on the leather horn by sheer willpower alone, was a small, fragile figure wrapped tightly in heavy wool. Throwing the door wide open to the screaming wind, Arthur rushed out into the biting, freezing air. He reached the exhausted animal just as the rider finally lost consciousness, beginning to slip dangerously sideways. Catching her effortlessly in his massive arms, he felt the terrifyingly light, limp weight of her body against his chest. As the heavy wool hood fell backward into the snow, the moonlight illuminated the pale, violently shivering face of Sarah Caldwell. "Sarah?" Arthur breathed into the freezing air, his deep, gravelly voice thick with absolute disbelief. "Arthur," she whispered weakly, her lips chapped and turning a dangerous shade of blue from the brutal altitude, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "They are coming. You have to." She could not finish the desperate warning. Her eyes fluttered shut as sheer exhaustion finally consumed her completely. Without a single second of hesitation, Arthur scooped her up securely and carried her swiftly into the welcoming warmth of the cabin. He kicked the door shut against the storm and laid her gently on his narrow, sturdy cot. He immediately piled every bearskin rug, heavy wool blanket, and thick fur pelt he owned over her trembling frame. Moving rapidly, he stoked the iron hearth until the fire roared like a furnace, then set a small, cast-iron pot of water to boil over the flames. Sitting on the edge of the wooden stool beside the cot, he took her freezing, gloveless hands and rubbed them vigorously between his massive, calloused palms, desperately trying to force the warm blood back into her numb fingers. He watched her chest rise and fall beneath the heavy furs, a profound, entirely unfamiliar ache blossoming deep within his chest. He had watched Sarah carefully from afar during his rare supply trips to the valley, quietly admiring her fierce intellect, her unwavering courage, and the gentle compassion she showed the townspeople. But to see her here, having risked the freezing, treacherous ascent entirely alone in the dead of night just to warn him, left him deeply, fundamentally shaken. Slowly, a healthy flush of color began to return to Sarah's pale cheeks. Her long, dark eyelashes fluttered gracefully, and she opened her warm hazel eyes, instantly finding Arthur's intense, piercing blue gaze locked steadily upon her. "You never should have come," Arthur said softly, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the quiet cabin. "The mountain in the dark shows absolutely no mercy to anyone." "I had to," Sarah whispered, her voice finally gaining strength as the heat of the fire seeped into her chilled bones. She reached inside her heavy, snow-dampened coat and pulled out a waterproof sealed leather tube, pressing it firmly into his calloused palm. "The matriarch bought the mountain for you, Arthur. You own it all. But Mayor Boone completely refuses to honor the pact." Arthur looked down at the leather tube in his hands, his jaw tightening into a hard, unforgiving line. "He hired a mercenary," Sarah continued urgently, sitting up slightly and gripping his muscular forearm with surprising strength. "A ruthless killer named Harlan Ford. He and 3 heavily armed men are riding up the trail at first light. They have strict orders to kill you, burn this cabin to the ground, and steal the deed. Boone wants the massive veins of silver hidden beneath this soil. He will stop at nothing to get it." Arthur did not panic, nor did he rush to arm himself further. He simply placed his large, warm hand gently over hers, offering a steadying reassurance. "Let them come," he stated, his voice completely devoid of fear, vibrating with an absolute, chilling certainty. "They will quickly find that the high country is not nearly as forgiving as the valley they rule." The romantic tension in the small, fire-lit cabin suddenly became palpable, a heavy, undeniable magnetic pull drawing them inextricably together. Arthur reached up slowly, his rough fingers brushing a stray, damp lock of dark hair carefully away from her soft cheek. Sarah leaned heavily into his gentle touch, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, no longer from the biting cold, but from the raw, undeniable connection forging rapidly between them. "You saved those girls yesterday," Sarah whispered, her hazel eyes locking onto his with fierce, unwavering devotion. "You are a truly good man, Arthur Callahan, and I will not let the greed of bad men take you from this world." Arthur leaned in closer, the remaining distance between them vanishing into the quiet warmth of the room. But just as their lips were about to brush, a deafening, thunderous crack completely shattered the intimate silence. A heavy, large-caliber rifle bullet tore directly through the thick wooden shutters, showering the cabin floor with jagged, splintered pine and embedding itself violently into the stone hearth just mere inches from Sarah's head. Harlan Ford had not waited for first light. The assassins were already here. The darkness inside the small cabin was immediate and absolute. As the echo of the rifle shot faded into the howling wind outside, Arthur Callahan moved with the lethal, unhesitating precision of a man who had survived 100 deadly encounters. He reached for a heavy iron bucket of melted snow sitting beside the hearth and hurled its freezing contents directly onto the roaring fire. A massive hiss of steam erupted, instantly plunging the room into pitch blackness and filling the air with a thick, blinding smoke. "Stay entirely flat against the floorboards, Sarah," Arthur commanded, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that cut through the hiss of the extinguished embers. "Do not move, and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Outside, the crunch of heavy boots in the snow signaled the approach of Harlan Ford and his 3 hired killers. They were fanning out, attempting to surround the structure. Ford barked a sharp command, and another volley of rifle fire tore through the heavy wooden shutters, splintering the oak and sending lethal shards of wood flying across the dark room. Arthur did not return fire from the windows. That was a fool's game that would only reveal his position. Instead, he crawled toward the back corner of the cabin, where a heavy, concealed trap door was built seamlessly into the floorboards. It was a secret egress he had dug years ago, leading out to a shallow trench beneath the snowpack. He lifted the heavy door without making a single sound, the freezing air rushing up to meet him. "I will be right back," Arthur whispered, his blue eyes flashing dangerously in the sliver of moonlight filtering through the bullet holes. He slipped down into the darkness, leaving Sarah huddled on the floor, clutching her small derringer with white-knuckled terror. Emerging from the trench 50 yards behind the cabin, Arthur blended perfectly into the stormy, snow-swept landscape. The wind howled mercilessly, masking the sound of his massive boots. He drew his twin Colt revolvers, slipping through the frozen pines like a vengeful specter. He spotted the first 2 mercenaries, men named Cole and Rufus, crouching behind a cluster of granite boulders, their rifles trained on the cabin's front door. Arthur did not offer a warning. He had given Amos Fowler a chance, and it had brought an army to his doorstep. He stepped out from the shadows, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Before Rufus could even register the massive figure looming behind them, Arthur brought the heavy steel barrel of his Colt crashing down against the back of the man's skull. Rufus dropped silently into the deep powder. Cole spun around, raising his Winchester, but Arthur was already inside his guard. A single, muffled shot from the Colt caught Cole in the chest, the sound swallowed instantly by the roaring mountain wind. 2 men down, 2 to go. Suddenly, a terrifying crash echoed from the front of the cabin. Harlan Ford, impatient and arrogant, had taken a heavy wooden log and smashed the front door entirely off its iron hinges. Ford stepped into the smoky, freezing interior of the cabin, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at his hip. Behind him stood the 4th mercenary, nervously scanning the tree line. "Callahan!" Ford roared, his raspy voice echoing off the log walls. "I know you're in here. Mayor Boone sends his absolute best regards." Sarah lay completely still beneath the cot, holding her breath, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Ford kicked a wooden chair out of the way, his boots crunching on the splintered floorboards. He struck a match off his belt buckle, the sudden flare of yellow light illuminating the small space. The flame reflected in Sarah's terrified hazel eyes. "Well now," Ford chuckled darkly, spotting her underneath the bed. "Looks like the mountain man has company. Come on out of there, little lady." Ford reached down, grabbing Sarah roughly by the arm and dragging her out from under the cot. She screamed, raising the small derringer, but Ford swatted it effortlessly from her trembling grip. "Let her go, Ford." The voice boomed from the shattered doorway, carrying a cold, murderous authority that froze the blood in Ford's veins. Arthur stood in the threshold, a towering silhouette against the snowy night, both Colts aimed directly at the mercenary's chest. The fourth killer, standing on the porch, had already been dispatched, his body slumped silently over the wooden railing. Ford panicked. He swung his shotgun toward Arthur, but he was vastly outmatched by a man forged in the fires of war. Arthur fired twice. The first bullet shattered Ford's right shoulder, spinning him violently backward and forcing him to drop the shotgun. The second bullet tore through his knee, sending the mercenary crashing to the floorboards in a screaming heap of agony and defeat. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. Arthur stepped into the cabin, kicking the shotgun away before kneeling beside Sarah. He pulled her into his massive arms, wrapping her tightly in his embrace. She buried her face in his heavy wool coat, shaking uncontrollably, but safe. "I have you," Arthur murmured softly, burying his face in her hair. "You are safe." When dawn finally broke, painting the high peaks in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, the true power of the matriarch's promise was revealed. Emerging from the tree line were a dozen heavily armed Apache warriors. They had heard the gunfire and ridden through the night to protect their newly crowned Indian. Arthur dragged the surviving, terrified Harlan Ford out onto the snow, tossing Mayor Boone's blood-soaked bounty ledger and the thick stack of greenbacks to the Apache captain. The warriors did not need words. They bound Ford to his horse, collected the evidence, and rode down the mountain. By noon, Silver Creek witnessed the absolute dismantling of Thaddeus Boone's corrupt empire. Confronted with the mercenary's confession and the irrefutable evidence of his treachery, Judge Harrison Webb ordered the immediate arrest of the mayor and Sheriff Tobias Flint, stripping them of their titles and banishing them to the territorial prison. Up on the serene, untouched peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains, Arthur Callahan stood on his porch, looking out over the breathtaking, legally protected expanse of his sanctuary. He was no longer a hermit, and he was no longer haunted by his past. Beside him stood Sarah, her hand resting warmly in his. The frontier was wild and unforgiving, but as Arthur pulled her close, watching the sun crest over their mountain, he finally knew the profound peace of a man who had fought through the darkness and found his way home. If you were absolutely captivated by this thrilling tale of frontier justice, untamed survival, and an unexpected romance that defied all odds, hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Arthur Callahan's incredible bravery proves that even in the most ruthless and corrupt times, genuine humanity and love can conquer the darkest of empires. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another breathtaking journey into the wild heart of the West. Leave a comment letting us know your favorite twist, and we will see you in the next video.